The van that never arrived. The road was empty when officers reached the bend. The headlights swept across a pair of shoes sitting neatly at the edge of the asphalt, untouched by dust or rain. A crumpled receipt lay beside them, stamped with a time that shouldn't have been possible. In the winter of 2008, in the outskirts of Groningen, Netherlands, a commuter van belonging to a small regional transport company left the dispatch station on what should have been a routine 37-minute loop. The driver, Erik Lammers, had run the route for nearly 9 years, rarely missing a check-in or deviating from the timetable. The van was logged over radio at 7:42 p.m., pulling out of the depot on its usual northern arc through a cluster of rural villages. But it never arrived at its first stop. It never reached its second. And it never appeared on any traffic camera, shop CCTV, or highway toll reader along its route. For the first 40 minutes, dispatch assumed a malfunction, an unreported detour or a communication blackout. It happened occasionally on winter nights when the wind shifted and the old radio system cut out. But by 8:30 p.m., when the van still hadn't checked in, the dispatcher placed a call that went unanswered. A second call followed, then a third. By 9:05 p.m., the route supervisor phoned the local police asking them to run a quick sweep. Officers expected to find a stalled vehicle on the shoulder or in a ditch. What they didn't expect was nothing at all. No tire tracks, no shattered branches, no sign that a 2-ton passenger van had passed through any part of its assigned corridor. The investigation began quietly. These stretches of the Dutch countryside, flat and exposed, rarely saw anything more dramatic than a drifting tractor or a wandering deer. But the first strange detail arrived before midnight. A local resident, Helena Voss, called to report that she'd heard a low mechanical hum drifting across a field behind her farmhouse sometime between 7:50 and 8 p.m. She assumed it was farm equipment. When officers asked which direction the sound had come from, she pointed toward an unlit service road that hadn't been used for years. That road did not appear anywhere near the van's scheduled route. By dawn, police had expanded the search radius. They traced the service road in full, walking the path with handheld lights. Mud pooled in its ruts. Weeds brushed their boots. Nothing suggested recent tire movement. But at its far end, near a hedgerow that curved toward the main highway, they found the first piece of evidence: a torn strip of reflective tape, the kind often used on commercial vehicles. It was caught in a branch at shoulder height. Investigators bagged it, though they weren't convinced it belonged to the missing van. Erik's family had already gathered at the station by mid-morning. His partner, Ingrid Hulse, told detectives that Erik never deviated from routine. He wasn't impulsive. He rarely took personal calls en route, and he almost never left the house without his old silver thermos. That detail would matter later. As hours slipped by, police pulled GPS logs from the transport company's internal system. This was where the second impossible detail emerged. Records showed the van's onboard GPS transmitting a normal, stable signal for the first 9 minutes of the route. Then, at 7:51 p.m., the signal froze. Not faded, not scrambled, frozen, as if the unit were suspended in time. The last recorded coordinates placed the van a kilometer south of its first stop. After that, nothing. Detectives considered equipment failure, but even an abrupt hardware malfunction usually produced a corrupted data spike. This log just stopped mid-sentence. Around noon, a highway maintenance worker radioed in from a stretch of road 15 kilometers off the van's official corridor. He'd spotted something near the drainage culvert: a pair of men's shoes placed neatly side by side, toes angled toward the road. They were dry, despite the frost. A small paper receipt lay beside them. The timestamp read 7:39 p.m., marked from a petrol station located 22 kilometers in the opposite direction of the van's departure path. The shoes were confirmed to be Erik's, but the receipt was strange. CCTV footage showed the cashier printing that exact receipt at 7:39 p.m., but there was no sign of Erik, no van parked outside, no customer resembling him. The purchase, a bottle of water and a pack of gum, did appear in the till system, but whoever bought them left without ever stepping into the camera's frame. This forced investigators to reconsider their assumptions. If the receipt was printed at 7:39 and the van's radio call occurred at 7:42, then Erik would have needed to travel an impossible distance in 3 minutes. He would also have had to abandon his shoes on a roadside he had no reason to visit long before anyone reported him missing. For the first time, police wondered if someone else was using his route knowledge against him. As the second day began, more officers canvassed fields and drainage ditches, combing for any sign of the vehicle. Cadaver dogs were brought in, not because police expected the worst, but because they needed to eliminate it. The dogs picked up a faint trace of Erik's scent on the service road, stretching only 50 meters before cutting off abruptly, as if he'd stepped into a pocket of air and vanished. When investigators retraced the path, they noted an odd detail. The stretch where the scent ended overlapped with a patch of disturbed soil. It looked like something heavy had been dragged, though the ground was too frozen to retain clear impressions. A detective ran his hand over the surface and felt the shallow indentation of parallel lines, too wide to be tire tracks, too narrow for farm machinery. No one could match them to anything immediately recognizable. By the third day, forensics had processed the reflective tape strip. The adhesive matched the type used on mid-2000s commercial vans, common enough not to prove anything, but similar to the missing one. More puzzling was the residue embedded in the tape fibers, microscopic grains of powdered limestone mixed with a petroleum binder. Local road crews hadn't used that blend in over a decade. Someone had brought an older material from somewhere else and placed it here. Detectives turned to Erik's routine again, hoping to find a trigger. His co-workers described him as steady, punctual, almost predictable. He clocked in early, cleaned his van thoroughly, and liked his route because it rarely changed. The only irregularity occurred 2 weeks prior, when he'd filed a brief note about a stalled vehicle sitting on a blind corner near Lauersmere. When police pulled the incident record, they found Erik's description of the vehicle vague. Dark-colored sedan, no plates visible, engine off. The driver hadn't approached him. The car was gone by the time a second bus passed. Investigators wondered if that sighting had been more deliberate than he realized. While detectives reviewed that, a technician in the GPS lab flagged an anomaly inside the frozen coordinates from the initial log. Hidden within the final transmission was a faint encrypted ping, too short to be typical vehicle telemetry. After decoding the metadata, they discovered what looked like a repeating signal buried under the standard data. It wasn't from the van. It came from an unknown device broadcasting on the same frequency band. This raised a chilling possibility. Someone might have overridden the van's GPS relay without ever physically touching it. The investigation shifted focus toward understanding how a vehicle could disappear without leaving the expected signs. Auto experts insisted a 2-ton van couldn't be lifted, buried, or disassembled in minutes without machinery or noise. If someone wanted to remove it cleanly, they would need a controlled environment, a warehouse, a garage, a loading bay. But no such building was found along the van's assigned path. Then detectives revisited Helena Voss's statement about the humming noise. Sound technicians examined the pattern she described and concluded it could have been produced by large hydraulic equipment powerful enough to manipulate heavy objects. But to use such machinery on a rural road in near darkness without attracting attention, someone would need perfect timing, detailed route knowledge, and a way to intercept the van at a predictable moment. The investigators circled back to the stalled sedan report. They began to suspect that someone had been watching the route long before the disappearance. By the end of the week, the case file had taken on a strange rhythm, half concrete evidence, half unanswered questions. On the 8th day, a firefighter assisting in the search noticed a faint oil sheen clinging to the surface of a pond near the edge of the industrial district.
When divers entered the water, they found nothing mechanical, but they did recover a fragment of metal no larger than a coin. It bore the remnants of a serial number typical of commercial vehicle components. Laboratory analysis revealed it had been exposed to heat far beyond what a standard engine would experience. This discovery introduced another new angle. If the van had been taken, they might have processed it through industrial machinery designed to strip metal quickly, equipment often found in scrapyards or illicit auto-dismantling operations. But that theory didn't explain why the van's GPS had frozen mid-route or why Erik's shoes had been carefully placed kilometers away. The detectives pieced together a provisional theory. The van might have been redirected through signal interference, brought to a stop somewhere off course, and then transferred rapidly to a waiting apparatus. But the precision required made the theory feel almost academic. There was also the lingering question of the time-stamped receipt. Investigators revisited the petrol station footage frame by frame, looking for reflections, windows, metal surfaces, anything that might show a silhouette off-camera. One frame captured what looked like a faint blur near the doorway at exactly 7:39 p.m., but the blur didn't resemble a person. It was only later, when technicians stabilized the footage, that a curious pattern appeared. The blur moved in perfect alignment with the automatic door's opening cycle, as if something had triggered the sensor without physically crossing the threshold. Police considered whether an object, rather than a person, might have been used to mimic a customer's presence. But that still didn't lead them to Erik. On the 12th day, investigators received an unexpected call from a freight company located 25 kilometers north. One of their night drivers had reported seeing an unlit vehicle frame strapped to a flatbed truck around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the disappearance. The driver hadn't noted the license plate, but he remembered the shape: long, box-like, with a sloping front. When shown reference images, he hesitated before saying it could have been the outline of a commercial van. Traffic cameras in that area were sparse, but one grainy clip captured a flatbed moving northbound at 10:32 p.m. The load had been covered by a heavy tarp, flapping slightly in the wind. No identifying details were visible. Still, it suggested the van might have been transported far from the search zone hours after its disappearance. But if the van had been moved, it would mean Erik was removed from the scene long before that. This led investigators back to the shoes. Forensic specialists worked on them for days, searching for soil, fibers, or residues. When the results came in, they pointed to something surprising. The soles carried traces of dried algae, typical of boating docks. The nearest marina was nearly 30 kilometers away. There was no reason for Erik to have visited a dock before or during his shift. Detectives expanded their search to include waterways feeding into the Northern Canal system. They discovered something subtle but important. On one of the smaller docks, a pressure mark on the wooden planks shaped like the edge of a plastic crate. The time-stamped receipt, tested again, showed faint water damage along one corner, as if it had briefly come into contact with damp wood. The team began forming another picture. If Erik had been moved, alive or otherwise, to a dock, it might explain the algae on his shoe soles. But it didn't explain why the shoes had been left neatly on a roadside, miles inland. Some investigators wondered whether the shoes had been placed intentionally, a signal, a misdirection, or a part of a plan to confuse the timeline. The fact that the shoes were dry on a freezing night suggested they were positioned long after the receipt had been dropped. Whoever left them likely understood how such evidence would be interpreted. By the third week, the investigation had accumulated clues without a unifying thread. The reflective tape with outdated material, the frozen GPS signal, the humming noise near the unused service road, the dock residue, the flatbed sighting. All of it pointed toward a coordinated effort rather than a solitary act.
An analyst reviewing the GPS interference discovered something that reframed the entire case. The repeating signal buried in the van's last transmission wasn't random. It matched a known pattern used in short-range fleet management scramblers, devices designed to mask vehicle movement by feeding false location data into legitimate systems. These devices were rare, expensive, and usually owned by industrial operators, not private individuals. Police visited companies known to use such equipment. Most had airtight inventory records, but one small transport firm on the outskirts of Winschoten reported a missing unit, a scrambler that had disappeared months earlier. When asked who last handled it, the manager named a former employee who had left abruptly, Rex Schouten. Schouten had a minor record for metal theft, nothing violent, but he had experience with vehicle electronics and he knew how to manipulate telemetry systems. When police checked his last known address, they found the apartment empty. Neighbors said he'd moved out days before the disappearance. A warrant produced no physical link between Schouten and Erik. No calls, no shared acquaintances, no financial ties. But Schouten had once attended the same automotive training program as a mechanic, currently working part-time at a scrapyard on the northern industrial fringe, the same district where divers had recovered the heated metal fragment. Detectives questioned the mechanic. He denied involvement, but mentioned that on the night the van disappeared, someone had accessed the yard's loading bay around 10 p.m. The security light had flickered on, but the person didn't stay long. The security CCTV system had been offline for repairs. Police searched the yard and found traces of hydraulic fluid near the ramp. Chemical analysis matched the same petroleum limestone blend found on the reflective tape. This was the first concrete link between the tape, the humming sound, and a location capable of dismantling a van quickly and quietly. But still, no sign of Erik. Detectives began focusing on the motive. There was no ransom demand, no financial incentive appearing in bank records, no threats made toward the transport company. If the target wasn't the driver, perhaps it was the vehicle or something inside it. The van's maintenance logs held an overlooked detail. 2 days before the disappearance, the vehicle had undergone a battery replacement. The mechanic had noted unusual corrosion buildup on the older battery. When investigators examined the new unit, they discovered it contained a faint but unfamiliar imprint beneath the serial code, something like a heat shadow. Specialists determined the mark resembled residue left by industrial trackers, small devices sometimes used to monitor shipments covertly. This implied the van might have been tagged without Erik's knowledge. If someone had planted a tracker, they could have monitored the van's exact position, waited for a moment when the road was empty, then interfered with its GPS system to isolate it. The lack of skid marks or struggle suggested Erik might have been approached in a controlled way, possibly by someone he believed needed assistance. Police reconstructed the timeline again. Between 7:42 p.m. and 7:51 p.m., the period between the radio check-in and the GPS freeze, the van was traveling through one of the least populated sections of the route. Only 2 houses overlooked the road, and both residents reported hearing nothing unusual. If someone knew the route perfectly, they could predict that silence. Detectives considered the unused service road once more. The scent trail had ended abruptly, the soil had been disturbed, and the hydraulic hum matched machinery capable of lifting or transferring a vehicle. If the van had been redirected there through signal interference, someone could have stopped it, removed Erik, and loaded the van onto a mobile platform in minutes. From there, it could be transported to the scrapyard for dismantling. The flatbed siding would fit into that chain. The heated metal fragment in the pond could represent an improperly discarded remnant. The algae on Erik's shoes, however, remained harder to place. One investigator proposed that Erik had been moved by boat at some point, either to conceal his path or to delay his discovery. But no witnesses reported seeing anyone transported on the water that night. The winter temperatures made nighttime boating unusual. Yet the algae matched only 2 marinas. One of them had a storage shed rented under a false name. Inside the shed, police found nothing but an empty crate, damp from condensation, and faint shoe impressions near the door. The impressions matched Erik's footwear pattern. There were no fingerprints, no DNA,
no cameras, no clear reason he had been brought there. Months passed. The scrapyard was investigated repeatedly. The marina was searched again. The service road was mapped with ground-penetrating radar. Every step brought more clarity about the method, but never about the motive. The only consistent image that emerged was of someone, possibly multiple people, who understood how to manipulate timestamps, surveillance blind spots, signal interference, and transport logistics in a way designed to leave almost no trace. Everything pointed to intentional misdirection. Shoes placed without dirt, receipts dropped where they didn't belong, tracks that ended before they began. The case file eventually expanded to more than 4,000 pages. Each new detail made the investigation more intricate rather than more complete. Even now, years later, what remains most unsettling is how quickly and quietly the vehicle disappeared. A van that large shouldn't be able to slip out of the physical world without noise, debris, or witnesses. Yet it did. The final entry in the official report reflects the smallest but most haunting detail. When technicians revisited the frozen GPS log for archival storage, they noticed a faint secondary ping appearing 7 seconds after the last coordinate. The ping did not match any known signal type used in Dutch transport systems. It was shorter, weaker, almost like the echo of another transmission. Its source was never identified. Whether it was interference, a glitch, or something intentional, the file leaves the line unresolved. The van never arrived, Erik never returned, and somewhere inside that frozen second, a fragment of the story remains sealed, still waiting to make sense.